Ask almost anyone what they know about Judas, and you'll get the same 3 facts back in the same order nearly every time. He betrayed Jesus. He did it for 30 pieces of silver. He hanged himself in remorse. Clean villain arc. 3 beats, done. The kind of story so familiar it barely needs telling anymore. Open the actual text, and that tidy version starts falling apart almost immediately. The Bible doesn't give you one account of how Judas died. It gives you 2, and they don't describe the same scene. The word most translations use for what he felt afterward isn't the word the New Testament normally uses for genuine repentance. It's a different word entirely, and the distinction matters. And the Greek verb usually rendered betrayed isn't a specialized word for treachery at all. It's an ordinary, everyday verb used constantly throughout the New Testament, including, more than once, for something God does. Something considerably messier and stranger is sitting underneath the Sunday school version of this story. Let's find out what it actually says.
Start with the death, because it's the detail everyone thinks they already know. And it's also where the text gets genuinely difficult. Matthew 27:5 says Judas went and hanged himself. That's the version everyone learns. But turn to Acts chapter 1, where Peter is addressing the other apostles after the resurrection, and you get a different picture entirely. Judas acquired a field with the reward of his wickedness, and falling headlong, he burst open in the middle, and all his bowels gushed out. No rope, no hanging, a fall and a graphic, specific description of what happened to his body when he landed. These aren't small stylistic differences. One writer describes a hanging, another describes a fall resulting in the body bursting open. People who study this seriously have proposed real harmonizations, a rope that snapped, a body left hanging until decomposition caused it to fall and rupture, and those readings are plausible, but they're reconciliations being built by later readers, not something either gospel writer states outright. The text itself simply hands you 2 different scenes and does not stop to explain how they fit together. Then there's what Judas felt. Matthew 27:3 says that when Judas saw Jesus condemned, he changed his mind. Older translations often render it repented himself. But the Greek word there, metamelomai, is not the New Testament's normal word for the kind of repentance that leads to transformation. That word is metanoia, used dozens of times across the Gospels and epistles for a genuine change of heart. Metamelomai shows up far less often, and it carries a narrower sense: regret, remorse, a change of mind about a decision, without the deeper turn that metanoia implies. Judas felt something real. Whether the text is telling you he was actually fully repentant or something short of that is a live question the word choice itself seems to be raising. And then there's the word for the betrayal itself. This word this entire story hinges on. It turns out not to be a specialized word for treachery at all.
Here's what's actually sitting inside this story, concretely. There's a real Greek verb, paradidomi, used 119 times across the New Testament, in contexts that range from treachery to entrusting someone with a task to God's own saving action. The exact same verb, same root, describing wildly different things depending entirely on who's doing it and why. There's a real place you could still locate today, a field outside Jerusalem, known by 2 different names in 2 different books of the New Testament, purchased with a specific, traceable sum of money that a much older prophetic text had already named centuries earlier: 30 pieces of silver, the specific legal price of a slave. And there's a real pattern. Judas is not the first person in the Bible whose act of handing someone over for money gets folded into a larger story the betrayer never intended and couldn't control. A word, a place with a price tag, and a pattern. Let's build all three. Start with who Judas actually was before any of this happens, because the traitor isn't where his story begins. John 12:6 tells us Judas held the money box for the group. He was the treasurer, the one the other 11 trusted enough to hand their shared funds to. That's not a minor role. It's a position built entirely on confidence in his character. Whatever happens later, it doesn't begin with Judas as an outsider or a plant. It begins with Judas as one of the 12 trusted with something concrete.
Now, the verb paradidomi is built from two simple pieces: para, alongside or over to, and didomi, to give, literally to give over. Strong's Greek lexicon lists it appearing 119 times across the New Testament, translated variously as deliver, hand over, and trust, give up, and yes, betray. But betray is only one shade of a much wider word, supplied by context, not built into the term itself. Here's where it gets genuinely strange. This is not a word the Gospels reserve for Judas. Jesus uses it about himself repeatedly before Judas ever acts. Matthew 20:18, the Son of Man will be handed over to the chief priests and scribes. Mark 9:31, the Son of Man is going to be delivered into the hands of men. Mark 10:33, nearly identical language again. 3 separate predictions in the same gospel tradition, all built on this same verb, paradidomi, describing what's going to happen to Jesus, spoken by Jesus before any betrayal has taken place. So by the time Judas actually walks to the chief priests in Matthew 26:14-16 and negotiates his price, 30 pieces of silver, agreed on the spot, the word the text will eventually use for what he does isn't a word invented for him. It's the same word Jesus had already been using about his own fate. The moral weight of betrayal isn't sitting inside the verb. It's something the story has to supply on top of it. And the 30 pieces of silver themselves aren't a random number pulled from nowhere. Zechariah 11:12-13, written centuries earlier, describes a shepherd figure being paid exactly this sum, 30 pieces of silver, and being told with oaken contempt to throw it to the potter. Exodus 21:32 sets 30 shekels of silver as the standard legal compensation for a slave killed by someone else's ox. This is specifically slave money. Whether or not the original prophecy in Zechariah was written with a future Messiah consciously in view is a separate question from what Matthew does with it. But the number itself, showing up again in Matthew's account of Judas's deal, is not coincidental scene dressing. It's a price tag with real weight already attached to it long before Judas names it.
Now the moment itself and where the real payoff sits. Luke 22:3 says plainly, "Then Satan entered into Judas." John's Gospel places the same detail at the Last Supper itself, John 13:27. After Judas takes the bread, Satan entered into him. Whatever else is true about this story, the text is telling you there's a spiritual dimension to it, not just a financial one. But watch what happens next. Judas doesn't go into some kind of trance. He gets up, walks to the chief priests, and negotiates, Matthew 26:15. "What will you give me if I deliver him over to you?" That's not the language of someone possessed against their will. That's someone naming a price. The text holds both of these things at once, without resolving the tension between them. Something dark has entered Judas, and Judas is still the one making the deal, clear-eyed, asking for a specific number. Then the kiss. In first-century Jewish culture,
A kiss on the cheek was an entirely ordinary greeting between a disciple and a teacher. Nothing sinister about the gesture itself. Judas weaponizes precisely that ordinariness, turning an unremarkable sign of respect into the signal that identifies Jesus for arrest. Matthew 26:48-49. And Jesus' response to it, Matthew 26:50, is almost unbearably restrained. Friend, do what you came to do. Not an accusation, not a question, an acknowledgement, as if he'd already known exactly what this moment was, using nearly the same idea the gospel writers had already been circling with paradidomi. Do the handing over you came here to do.
Here's the payoff. Romans 8:32, Paul writing to a church decades later about God the Father, He who did not spare His own Son, but gave Him up for us all. The Greek verb Paul uses there, paradidomi, is the same verb, same root, same basic action, paradidomi. Handed over, given up. Sit with that for a second. The exact same verb describes Judas walking to the chief priests to sell out a friend for money, and describes God the Father's own act of giving up His Son for the world's salvation. One of those is universally remembered as the worst betrayal in human history. The other is remembered as the greatest act of love ever recorded. The word itself doesn't tell you which one you're looking at. Only the character doing the handing over and why does that. Judas hands Jesus over out of greed or fear or whatever was moving in him that night. The Father hands the Son over out of love. Same verb, opposite moral universe. That gap is not an accident of translation. It's the sharpest edge in this entire story, and almost nobody points it out.
This isn't the first time the Bible tells a story shaped exactly like this one, and the earlier version even uses the same basic pattern, if not the identical word. Genesis 37. Joseph's own brothers, driven by jealousy, sell him to traders for silver, 20 pieces in that account, sending him into slavery in Egypt. It's a human betrayal, financially motivated, carried out by people who were supposed to be closest to him. Decades later, after Joseph has risen to power in Egypt and his brothers come to him starving, not knowing who he is, he reveals himself and says the line that reframes the entire story. Genesis 50:20. You meant evil against me, but God meant it for good. The betrayal was real, the human evil in it was real, and none of that stopped God from folding it into a larger purpose the brothers never intended and couldn't have controlled. That's the same shape Judas's story takes, and the gospel writers seem to know it. Jesus doesn't predict his own paradidomi once in a single ominous aside. He predicts it 3 separate times across the synoptic tradition: Matthew 20:18, Mark 9:31, Mark 10:33. Treating what's coming as something that has to happen, that fits inside a larger plan, while never once excusing the person who actually does the handing over. Judas is never let off the hook for the choice he made, and the gospel writers are equally insistent that his choice, terrible as it was, didn't derail anything. It fulfilled something. The same double vision Joseph gives his brothers, real human evil, real divine purpose, both fully true at once, sits underneath Judas's story too, 4 centuries and 1 covenant later.
So what do you do with a story the text itself refuses to fully resolve? Start by not resolving what the Bible doesn't resolve. The 2 death accounts, Matthew's hanging, Luke's fall and rupture in Acts, sit side by side in the New Testament without a harmonizing footnote from either writer. People have proposed real, thoughtful ways these could describe the same underlying event from different angles, and those attempts deserve to be heard honestly, rather than dismissed. But the text itself simply presents both, unresolved, the way an honest set of records sometimes does when nobody was there to write it down in the moment. Even the field carries two names. Matthew 27, 7-8 calls it the potter's field, bought with the returned blood money as a burial ground for foreigners. Acts 1:19 says the residents of Jerusalem called it, in their own language, Akeldama, field of blood. Two names, two writers, one patch of ground outside the city, still identifiable by both descriptions. Nobody smoothed the record into a single tidy label. That refusal to tidy things up is itself worth noticing. Judas returns the money before he dies, Matthew 27, 3-5, telling the chief priests plainly, "I have sinned by betraying innocent blood." And the priests, having just orchestrated a judicial murder, refuse to put the silver back into the temple treasury because it's blood money, a scruple about ritual cleanliness from men who had no scruple at all about the killing itself. The text doesn't soften that irony. It just lays it out and lets you sit with it.
One word covers the worst betrayal in this story and the deepest act of love inside it, and the Bible never bothers to give you a separate vocabulary for villains. That's what's actually unsettling about paradido once you've traced it all the way through. It isn't a warning label built into the language, flashing red the moment someone's about to do something unforgivable. It's just the ordinary word for handing something or someone over. And it turns out that almost everything meaningful in this story, good and catastrophic alike, runs through that same plain verb. Judas had access, trust, proximity, the money box, a seat at the table, a front row view of everything Jesus said and did for 3 years, and none of it, on its own, changed what was underneath. Whatever entered him that night in the upper room met a decision he still had to make himself, and he made it. The text doesn't let you turn Judas into a simple monster safely unlike you. It doesn't let you excuse him either. It holds both at once, real spiritual darkness and a real deliberate human choice, the same unresolved honesty it brings to his death, to the two names of that field, to the exact texture of what he felt afterward. Regret, the text seems to specify, carefully choosing the narrower word, not necessarily the deeper turn. Proximity to the truth was never the same thing as belonging to it. Judas sat close enough to hand Jesus a piece of bread from the same dish. That's not a footnote. That's the whole warning, if you're willing to hear it as one.
If you'd always assumed betrayed was simply what the Greeks said, and never clocked that the New Testament uses that exact verb for what God did too, that's the exact kind of gap this channel exists to close. Subscribe if you want the next one. Comment whether you land on genuine remorse or something short of it for Judas, and share this with someone who's only ever heard the 3-beat version of this story. Thank you for being here. God bless you.